What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from Yugioh from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and back with another video that's actually been requested by my patrons. It's been a while since I've done this one before, but I do have a Patreon linked in the description down below if you want to support me directly, and if you sign up for some of the higher tiers, you will get the option to recommend a video for me to do in the coming month. And one of my newest patrons, Damon Hess, they requested me to do a sort of skill tier list. So going through all the formats that I've covered and ranking them in terms of skill. For some reason, I have this like weird memory in the back of my mind of doing something similar to this in the past with like an X and Y axis, and I was placing them in 2 dimensions based on like skill or luck or whatever. But I went through all the videos on my channel. I couldn't find that. So I'm just going to decide to mix up the format entirely from what may be a dream or not. I don't know. But we're just going to do a regular tier list. And I know that different formats require different types of skill and things like that. Some formats require you to be more aggressive. Some formats require you to sort of manage the aspect of luck and what role it plays in your game. And also within these formats themselves, different decks will have different skill ceilings and skill floors. You know, some decks will just naturally be more prone to variance than others, and some decks will be more skill intensive than others. So I'm going to try and talk about all of that when going through each format itself. But if I do like leave something out or something like that, then let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. And know that this is all my own opinion. Now, my opinion is based on playing through all these different formats and playing a variety of decks in these formats. But at the end of the day, it is perfectly fine if you disagree with it. I'm not perfect. No one is. And so I fully expect that I will put something on this list in a place where you do not believe it belongs. And, you know, if I do that, please let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. Now, as of the time of making this video, I am at Perfect Circle format. This is the format that I am covering. And so I won't be going beyond Perfect Circle format, even though I have played some other formats just on my own. You know, I feel like I just want to go through the things that I've shown on the channel, and if this video does well and people like it, I can definitely update this in the future after I've got a couple more formats under my belt. But we're going to start right at the beginning with Yugi-Kaiba format, the very first format in the game's history in May of 2002. That's when the Limitless gets introduced. Yugi-Kaiba format was extremely popular, but its popularity has fallen off a bit with the introduction of a new deck like Stall Mill. Now, this might be a little bit controversial, given Stall Mill is in the format, but I actually am going to put Yugi-Kaiba more on the pure skill side of things. Now, I realize that I should also explain these tiers. The tiers, pure skill does not mean that, like, it is 100% skill. There's always going to be luck in any game of Yu-Gi-Oh! That you have, but these are the formats that take the most amount of skill to actually win games, and generally, if you've got a skilled player versus an unskilled player, that skilled player is going to win those games, like 8 or 9 times out of 10. Rewards good players are formats that do require a little bit more luck to actually win consistently. But, you know, if you're a good player and you're making better plays than your opponent overall, you will be more likely to win those games. And, you know, these formats are ones that really do reward good players and good play. Some luck needed are formats where, like, if you are a really good player, you're still going to have a higher win rate than someone who's a less good player, but it does take a bit more luck to actually consistently win. And the best players in the room will not necessarily consistently be winning against the worst players, well, maybe not the worst players in the room, but people who are a bit below their skill level. Lots of variants are formats where, like, it really could go either way. I mean, good play does help a bit, and, you know, it's also going to depend on what decks you play and things like that, but there can just be non-games, right? That's something that can just happen, and just you could get screwed over by the luck entirely. And then coin toss are formats where no matter how skilled you are in it, it won't really make too much of a difference. You know, at the end of the day, the cards are going to happen as they happen. And, you know, it's not really much you can do to push the lever on, like, win rate and things like that. Now, to be fair, I think, like, if you just take these at their base value of their name, I don't think that any Yu-Gi-Oh! Format requires pure skill, and any Yu-Gi-Oh! Format is completely a pure coin toss. But I do think that, like, we can sort of approximate the limits with these labels. So Yugi-Kaiba format, I do actually think, is a pure skill format in that it is very, very stripped down to its fundamentals. You know, you have to have very good fundamentals if you want to consistently win in Yugi-Kaiba format. And even though Stall Mill is a deck now that is sort of just like this oppressive presence in the metagame, you know, soul control decks can beat Stall Mill like somewhat handily if you've got a good soul control player. And Stall Mill itself is a deck that does take a lot of work. We've seen the best Stall Mill player in the game, the one who actually innovated the deck, DK0, consistently win events with the deck. But since then, you know, people have really struggled to actually win with it. So that deck takes a lot of skill. The Soul Control deck takes a lot of skill. If you want to play a rogue deck in this format, you're going to need a lot of skill to do that, believe me. So I do think that Yugi-Kaiba is more of a pure skill format than a lot of the others. And also, it's got sort of the least amount of power cards compared to a lot of these other formats because it's the first set in the game's history. So even though you do have the Power 5 running around, they're just 5 cards in the deck. Whereas in later formats, you get a lot more cards that can be a lot more powerful and swingy. So Yugi-Kaiba format, I am going to put in pure skill. Next up, we've got Critter format, which is in July of 2002, and I actually think that this is more pure skill than Yugi-Kaiba. Now, this may seem weird because I, was just talking about how one of the reasons why Yugi-Kaiba is so skillful is because it's stripped down to its fundamentals, and you'd think that adding more things to the card pool would then sort of blur the line there and introduce a bit more variance. And to be fair, there are some things that Critter does introduce that do apply more variance. However, I think for the most part, Critter does indeed take a lot more skill than Yugi-Kaiba. Heavy Storm is in the format now, which means that, you can't just commit all your back row and be like, well, my opponent can't deal with this. You actually have to consider what you're setting in the back row in addition to what you're setting in terms of your monsters. Also, Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, those are cards that introduce more choices for the player without necessarily making things too swingy. Of course, if one player sees Sangan and Witch, they're probably going to win compared to if their opponent does not see Sangan and Witch. But I will say that picking what you search out with Sangan and Witch can make a big difference. And managing your resources is just a general theme of Critter that makes it so skill intensive and very, very cool. So I like Critter a lot. I think it's one of my favorite formats that I've covered on the channel. And it really is one of the most skill intensive formats in the game. So I highly encourage that people play it. Next up, we got Treasure format. Treasure format is a format that I also think is pretty skillful, but it has the hand rip cards in it now. It has Snatch Steal in it now. It has a bunch of crazy stuff from Magic Ruler that does definitely change the game quite a bit. I think that this format is the first one that really steps down from pure skill, and it does just reward good players, in my opinion. The main reason for this is that you can get some absolutely disgusting openers with the hand rips. Like if you open 2 or even 3 hand rips, then your opponent's just out of luck, basically. Or if you open up like Duo and Magician of Faith and you get back the Duo with Magician of Faith, you can just rip your opponent's hand to shreds. And, while there are some weird degenerate combos you can do with Magician of Faith in Critter format, like Magician of Faith into Pot of Greed, so you get to repeat that, which is obviously very good. I think the Treasure basically takes it to another level. And, when you do lose out to things like that in Treasure, it is definitely a bit more luck-based, in my opinion, than in Critter format. So I'm going to put it in rewards good players. I don't think it goes below that, even though it does have the hand rips. I'm sure a lot of people will say, oh, hand rips automatically down here or something like that. But I actually think that the hand rips are more balanced in Treasure than they will be much later in the game. Because, the Sangan and Witch Train is so powerful in these old formats. They are semi-limited, and so a common thing that you see is someone just searches out another Sangan or another Witch. Just keep that resource train going, and the hand rips are a counter against that. So using your hand trip correctly and at the right time is an important skill here. And also ordering your hand rips and things like that is important. Also, painful choices now in this format. Some decks don't even play painful choice, but the decks that do, that introduces a lot of skill into the format because there aren't really any easy send-off painful choice like you'd get later in something like Chaos format, right? So I think Treasure format does still reward good players. We're still in this sort of skill area, in my opinion, at the top of the list. Although I actually do think the next format, Imperial format, brings things just down a little bit into some luck needed. Now, this might be controversial because I know a lot of people love Imperial format. And just so you know, like where the formats lie on the skill chart does not necessarily mean anything related to their quality, right? There are some formats that I really love that might not necessarily be on the same level of pure skill as something like Yugi-Kaiba, which have sort of fallen out of favor with me in recent times with the rise of Stall Mill. So where a format lies on this list doesn't necessarily equate to enjoyability. There are plenty of formats that are very enjoyable that do require some amount of luck, but that doesn't mean that they're any worse than they would be otherwise. So I know Imperial format's one of the more popular formats from this time, but I do think it drops down to some luck needed because of the inclusion of Imperial Order. Imperial Order is a crazy card. It is basically an instant win button. Not quite an instant win button, of course, because there are monsters that can do things while it is up. But I think in this format in particular, compared to something like the next format, Android format, where you have a bit more options in the monsters, here basically your game plan when Imperial Order goes up is generally to stall with like your Sangan, Witches, Tomatoes, things like that, and just sort of wait out your opponent as they burn themselves down with the Imperial Order. If you can stick a Jinzo, that's great because Jinzo can shut off the Imperial Order. But Jinzo also is a problem in itself, right? You have Jinzo and Call the Haunted. So basically, if you can get the Jinzo into rotation, you can just dominate your opponent. pretty easily there. There aren't as many outs to Jinzo, so Jinzo also becomes sort of like not an instant win condition like Imperial Order is in my opinion, but I do think it is very, very powerful. So I will put this format in some luck needed. Again, it's more skillful than a fair amount of formats that will come after it, but I do think that it is the least skillful of these first four. Again, that doesn't mean it takes no skill. It just means that compared to some of the higher levels of skill in the previous formats, I think it does belong down here. But next up, we've got Android format. This is the second format in 2003. And this introduces a lot of cards from Labyrinth and Nightmare. And this one, I actually think it either belongs like in some luck needed above Imperial Order or in rewards good players, but probably below Treasure. Yeah, I think because I briefly considered it going above Treasure, I think it does belong in rewards good players. Both Android format and Imperial format are kind of tier 0 formats. And of course, like Critter and Treasure, maybe with more exploration would become that as well. But these two are things that like, it is very clearly a tier 0 format where like the best deck in the room, which is, you know, tomato control, you could call it in both formats. It's just playing a bunch of good stuff cards and just dominating their opponents with it. And I think the tier 0 mirror match in Android format is a little bit more skill intensive than the one in Imperial format, just because there's a bit more to consider. Android format introduces a trio of monsters, Gemini Elf, Keki the Ghost Destroyer, and Bazoo the Soul Eater, that all are sort of checked on each other in different ways. Bazoo the Soul Eater can beat over Gemini Elf most of the time. Gemini Elf can beat over Keki the Ghost Destroyer, and Keki the Ghost Destroyer can cut off the Bazoo from being able to banish stuff and thus get over it that way. And also Torrential Tribute is now in the format as well, so you have to consider like how much you commit into the board. Of course, you've had to do that in the past with things like Mirror Force, but Torrential Tributes have 3 copies, and it's still an open question of whether you want to play a ton of Torrential Tributes, a ton of Trap Holes, and that may seem weird to people who are not familiar with the Android format, but board presence is very, very important in that format. So, you know, if you've got your beater up and your opponent summons out the beater that beats over your beater, then a Trap Hole would be better for you in that situation than a Torrential Tribute, which is why a lot of people do play Trap Hole. But still, managing to like weigh the risk and reward of playing into something like a Trap Hole or a Torrential Tribute or doing a different play is very important in this format. And I just think it is a very skill-intensive format overall. So I do think it goes above Imperial, but I do think it is slightly below Treasure because, you know, Imperial Order is in the format. There are some sacky things that can happen in the format as well. So I am going to put it below Treasure because I think Treasure is a bit more of a grind. And while, you know, control games and aggro games, they take different skills. So I'm not going to just disqualify a format for just being a bit more aggressive than a control-based format. I do think in this case, the control games in Treasure are a little bit more skillful than the back and forth more aggressive games in Android format. But moving on from Android format, we get to Joey-Pegasus format. And Joey-Pegasus format, I mean, I feel like my opinions on this have been like very outspoken in the past. And so I'm sure that longtime viewers of the channel can guess where I'm going to put this, but I want to preface this by saying that, you know, these are just my personal thoughts, and do not take this personally, but I'm going to put Joey-Pegasus format in the coin toss category. And the reason I'm going to do this is because you have access to 2 Graceful Charity, and 2 Graceful Charity is really nuts. There's not really a way to balance that out in this format because, you know, Joey-Pegasus form basically the same card pool as Android, slightly different limited list to account for the Graceful Charities and stuff like that. But Graceful does so much for the decks in Android format. It both sets up the graveyard for things like Skull Lair, like Bazoo the Soul Eater, and it also just draws you so deep into your deck. If you go first and you draw at least 1 Graceful, then you can draw into everything else you want to have, and just getting that advantage right away, potentially sticking an IO or something like that, is just completely dominating your opponent. And I think, like, so I mentioned in my big year-end tier list or year-start tier list, depending on how you want to view it, when I went through the sort of Joey-Pegasus tier list, I don't actually think Joey-Pegasus is a tier 0 format like Android format and Imperial format is. I think that, you know, sort of things have shifted away from tier 0, but a big reason for that is because every deck has access to that double Graceful Charity, and it really does make the game so much swingier that any deck can really win. Now, that being said, of course, this format does take some skill. I mean, we've had players play in the tournaments that have been held for Joey-Pegasus format that have done consistently well. So, of course, you know, skill does play a factor here. And I'm not trying to say that there's no skill involved, but I do think that compared to all the other formats I'm going to cover on this list, I think Joey-Pegasus is really one of the ones that relies the most on luck and the most on good openings and things like that. Again, there is skill involved, but I do think that compared to these others, it's just night and day. But now we get into Fiber format. Fiber format is, in my opinion, a bit better than Joey-Pegasus format because Fiber format does have Fiber Jar, which does allow you to sort of reset the advantage that a player can get with the Gracefuls turn 1. And there are plenty of ways to search out Fiber Jar through tomatoes getting Sangins and Witches, which then searches out the Fiber Jar and getting that set up. So there are plenty of ways to get Fiber Jar online, and using Fiber Jar well does definitely take a fair amount of skill. And of course, the Fiber Jar Discord server holds Fiber tournaments every month. And, there have been some very consistent winners in these Fiber format tournaments. But I do also think that as the format has been labbed out more and more, and have decks, sort of been discovered more and more, and, matchups have been played more and more, I personally think that Fiber might actually fall into lots of variants. It's definitely not in coin toss levels, but I think it's either lots of variants or some luck needed. The reason for this is it still has double Graceful Charity. And any format with double Graceful Charity in it is going to be inherently unbalanced, because one player will be seeing a lot more of their deck if they, for instance, open double Graceful Charity initially than the other player will. Now, of course, there are some benefits to double Graceful Charity that I haven't mentioned yet, which is like, if your opponent opens a hand rip against you and you've got a Graceful Charity in hand, you still have one Graceful Charity left in deck, right? But I do think that because double Graceful Charity is still in the format, I don't quite think it can rise above lots of variants for me right now. Again, I'm saying this as a person who's won multiple Fiber tournaments, right? And so, I'm not trying to disregard the skill level of anyone who's won these events. And that applies to any of these, right? And I'm just saying, based on my own opinion, having played a lot of games of Fiber format, I do think that it leans more on variants, especially as more people get better at the format. And this is going to be something that sort of comes up more as sort of a difference between certain formats, is that the formats that get labbed out a lot more will be sort of pigeonholed into lists or tiers that go on one extreme or the other, right? Imperial is kind of the exception to that, because Imperial has also been labbed out comparatively, relatively high amount compared to some other formats here, but it's still in some luck needed, in my opinion. But like, you'll see later on that as formats get labbed out more, I would have potentially called Fiber in the rewards good player tier when we were first playing it. But as it's gone labbed out more, I do think it sort of falls more into the lots of variance tier, just as people get better at knowing what to do. The real difference between players comes down to the luck of drawing Graceful Charities and things like that. So I'm going to put it in lots of variants here. Still very fun format. I encourage people to try it out, and I encourage people to try out all of these formats for yourselves. Don't just take my word for them. I think they're all fun in their own way, but that's where I'm going to place it in terms of skill. Next up, we've got Yata format. Yata format is one of my favorites of the DM era. I think it's a blast. Honestly, it might be the favorite format that I've covered on the channel, period. It's just so much fun to play. It's basically like you get to play with all the DM power cards of your childhood, but also it's a very, very balanced format, and, no one gets too blown out by it. So you might be surprised when I actually put Yata in some luck needed. I'm going to put it here, and I do stand by this decision, because Yata format, while it is sort of the peak of the DM era and no power card is too imbalanced, because there are so many power cards running around, I do think it sort of comes down to like, well, if one person draws certain power cards and the other person did not, that person can win a fair amount of the time. Now, I do think that this goes above Imperial in some luck needed, because I think that honestly, this could rise up to rewards good players, especially with more testing, because Yata format, while it's widely high regarded by a lot of people in the retro community who've played it, it has not really had many tournaments, and not many people have actually played it. So, if this gets labbed out more, maybe the matchups will go more into rewards good players or above. But I do think that just having so many power cards available to it, and also getting down to the top deck situations a lot of the time, and also having blow cards like Mirage of Nightmare now legal in the format, I do think that this does go in the some luck needed tier instead of some of the others. But top of the some luck needed tier. And I'm not sure if it will fall from the top of the some luck needed tier here. But we go from one of the best formats in the DM era to, in my opinion, one of the worst formats in the DM era, and that is Scientist format. Scientist format has triple Magical Scientist in it, and it does have the Scientist FTK online. Of course, it doesn't have Monster Gate in the format, so you don't have to worry about that at least, but it is kind of a brutal format. Now, Scientist FTK, it's not going to win every event, every game. We've seen that multiple times. They have held a fair amount of tournaments for this format, surprisingly many given what it is. And Science FTK, while it has, put up numbers in like Top Cut and things, it is not one. So, it's not all purely FTK format. But because Science FTK is in the format and is widely played, I am actually going to put this in coin toss. And I know that may seem weird, especially because if you play the non-scientist matchups, the format can be somewhat skillful. But I do think that because Scientist FTK is such a big factor in the format, I think it does belong in coin toss. And it's not even to the point where like Scientist FTK is like rogue or below. If it was rogue or below, I'd probably move it up a couple tiers or something like that. But because Scientist FTK is such a presence right now, I think it does belong in coin toss because that deck is basically flipping a coin, right? And it's not even flipping a coin based on who goes first or second. It's flipping a coin based on like, can the Scientist FTK deck actually pull off their FTK, you know? And because of that, I think that this does belong in coin toss tier. Again, you know, I've mentioned before whenever I discuss FTK decks, by putting it in a category like this, I don't mean that FTK decks do not take any skill to pilot, because they do take skill to pilot. You know, there are different decisions that you have to make. You have to weigh different probabilities of whether a certain, you know, order of your cards will actually make a difference in terms of what happens on the board state and what your opponent will call off reasoning and things like that. But that being said, you know, you can't deny that FTK decks are heavily based on luck, right? I would say they're based more on luck than skill, even though they do take skill to pilot. And for that reason, I'm putting this in the coin toss tier because this deck is so prevalent in that format. Next up, we got Vampire format. I'm going to move Vampire format. This is going to be a bit interesting. So I mentioned earlier that I think that, you know, control formats are often viewed as being more skillful than more aggressive formats. And, you know, I think that that does apply for Vampire because Vampire is a more aggressive format. And it's kind of polarizing. Some people really like it. Some people really hate it. I'm sort of falling on the, like, I'm sort of neutral toward it. I think it's a good format for learning tempo, but beyond that, it's like a bit iffy because TD Warrior Lady is at 3 copies and just dominates all the games that you play. Science FTK is legal in the format, but Science is at 1, so it's a bit less consistent than it would be otherwise. I actually am going to put Vampire format in rewards good players because I do think that if you are good at aggression, then you will dominate in Vampire format. And if you're not good at aggression, you know, Vampire format is a great format to learn how to push, knowing when to push, knowing how to use tempo to your advantage. And I do think that Vampire format relatively underexplored, but with more exploration, I think this will just continue to reward good players and potentially even rise to pure skill in the future. Now, that being said, it does have its fair share of sacky cards. I mean, all the formats before the ban list that have certain cards legal in them is going to have some level of sack to them. But I do think that Vampire format is oftentimes like sort of denigrated for its aggressive style of play, but I do think that that style of play is definitely one that rewards players who know how to, you know, actually play it. And so that's why I will put it in the reward good player tier. Actually, I think I'm going to put it above the Android format in this tier, because I think Android's more about learning a mirror match, whereas Vampire is more about grasping certain fundamentals of the game. So I'm going to put it here, maybe even above Treasure. But I'm not quite willing to put it above Treasure because I do think the grind of Treasure does take a little bit more skill to navigate than the sort of aggressiveness of Vampire. Because I think with Treasure, you still need to know when to push with your stuff. So it like still tests some of the skills the Vampire format tests while also testing other skills as well. So I'm going to still put Treasure above Vampire. But I think Vampire does go and rewards good players here. But now we go from Vampire format to the format that broke Yu-Gi-Oh! We go to Chaos format. Chaos format is a blast to play. Really, really fun stuff. That being said, I think it's kind of like Yata, where I think there is a lot of variance involved. I'm going to put it... Oh, do I put it above or... I'm going to put it below 5. Oh, maybe not. So the thing about Chaos format is that, like, it's sort of like the Yata thing of, like, you've got so many power cards in the world that it kind of balances itself out. But the power cards in Chaos format are so much more powerful. The game's end very, very quickly. The skill is involved in managing what you're doing and also playing around your opponent's power cards. So I don't think it's coin toss format, right? A lot of people view it as a coin toss format, but I do think the Chaos format is a little bit more skillful than some of the formats in the coin toss tier. But I'm unsure if it goes above or below Fiber. I think right now I'm actually going to put it above Fiber. And the reason for that is honestly because it's less labbed out. If it gets more labbed out and people sort of get to know what plays to do more often, I think it could definitely come down more to just like, well, okay, you know, who's luckier, right? And, you know, it could just be lots of variance below Fiber. But I think as of now, it's still lots of variance, but I think as of now, like, it is a bit more skillful to navigate the Chaos matches than the Fiber matches, especially if you go up and against some tricky decks. Although I will say that some of the decks like, you know, Jar Turbo, right, which is basically a variation on like 3-Mock, which is playing triple Dark Magician of Chaos, trying to OTK your opponent. That plays a bit more luck-based, right? So that also kind of lowers its variance a little bit compared to some Fiber gameplay. I want to put it below Fiber, actually. I've convinced myself, because I think it just comes down to the different types of decks that you're playing in these formats, and Chaos does have a fair amount of decks that are a little bit more luck-based than the Fiber decks are, I think, on average. So I am going to put Chaos below Fiber then. But I still think it's a fun format to play, so definitely try it out if you're interested in that. But with that, we get to the last format of the DM era. Right before GOAT format, we get Warrior format, which is very similar to GOAT in terms of card pool, but its ban list does really set it apart a bit. And Warrior format is one of my favorite formats from this time period as well. I am going to put it in... It's tough. It's really between rewards, good players, and some luck needed, but I am going to put it in some luck needed. And the reason for that is, I think that it's a very skill-intensive format, but Scientific Decay is still legal. And Scientific Decay actually did indeed win a Warrior format tournament in the past. So the deck does have some legs. I think it's honestly a rogue tier deck. Like, I don't think the Scientist FDK in like bigger formats, or bigger tournaments that is, would actually do as well as it did in that one tournament that it won, because that was a small double elimination tournament, which of course will sort of shift what decks can actually do well compared to more well-attended events. But I do think that because Scientific Decay is in the format, you can't really put it in rewards, good players, or pure skill yet. I think with more exploration, this could definitely rise in the ranks, because it is very, very similar to GOAT format. And I think if you're looking for a format that's like GOAT, but just slightly different because you're a bit tired of Chaos Turbo and stuff, then Warrior format is for you. That being said, Chaos Turbo is still underexplored in the format, so I don't know, maybe with more experimentation, that deck will rise in the rankings. But I do think that a lot of the decks in Warrior format do require a fair amount of skill, just like how they do in GOAT format. But if you're coming to it from GOAT format, you do have to adjust your sort of thinking to actually get good at the format, because they work in some different ways, in some very minor but very important ways. So I'm going to put this in some luck needed at the top of that tier, just because of Scientific Decay mainly. But as time goes on, I definitely anticipate this rising in rewards, good players, or pure scale, or maybe if Scientific Decay actually does turn out to be the best deck in the room, just down to the coin toss with the Scientist format itself. But I think as of now, it's still smack dab in the middle in some luck needed. But now we move on to GX, and we move on to GOAT format. And GOAT format is a format, you know, I can't really say too much to add to the conversation, because it's a format that everyone knows. Everyone's played it. It's a great format. If you haven't played it, try it out. It's a lot of fun. And I think this sort of gets back to what I mentioned earlier with like how well labbed out these formats are. I think GOAT format is in the pure skill tier, and I'm going to put it above Login. Now, of course, as time goes on, people have talked and talked and talked about how GOAT format is not pure skill, right? Like, there is some luck involved, and at the high levels, if you want to win a tournament with some of the best GOAT players in the world, you're going to need some luck to actually reach that level. But you know, on the flip side, you're also going to need a lot of skill to actually get to that level and compete. And I think that GOAT format is one of the most skill-intensive formats in the game right now. I actually think of the most popular retro formats, I think GOAT format is probably the most skill-intensive right now to get into, and that's largely because it has about a decade of people labbing this format out, really getting good at it. And, you know, with more time, I think some of the other formats could maybe surpass it. But I think GOAT format has stood the test of time partially because of how skill-intensive it is. And yes, it is being dominated by Chaos Turbo now, but we've seen time and time again, other decks actually manage to take the crown from Chaos Turbo in different tournaments. And so, you know, a big reason why those decks were able to actually do well is because the players playing them are very, very skill intensive. You know, they've grinded this format out. They've really, really done a lot of work with it. So I do think this format does belong in pure skill for now. And I'm going to put below Critter, and the main reason I'm going to put below Critter is because Critter format is less labbed out than GOAT, which is sort of a paradox, right? Because I'm saying that GOAT format is in this tier because it's so labbed out, and Critter's in this tier because it's not labbed out. But the reason for that is because if you want to win a game in Critter format, you're not going to have a roadmap for you, right? People are still tinkering with decks in that format. People are still trying to figure out what the best plays are, what the best cards are, and Critter format is still going a lot of development, right? And so that means that I think as of now, Critter format does belong above GOAT format, because if you want to win tournaments in Critter format, you're going to need a lot more just raw skill to play in it. And you won't be able to grind as much as in GOAT format because Critter is much newer. And so I do think that Critter format is a bit above GOAT here. But I am going to put GOAT above Yugi-Kaiba, because I think Yugi-Kaiba, once you get a grasp on the fundamentals and what you need to do, I think it is a bit easier than managing all the different situations you have to consider in GOAT format. So I am going to put it in between Critter and Yugi-Kaiba for now. But moving on from GOAT format, we get into the Cyber-Stein era of the game, where Cyber-Stein decks are dominating. And spoiler alert, these formats are not really going to go in the top of this tier list. Now, that being said, as I mentioned for some of the other formats here, these formats do take some skill, you know. I think, like, these are aggressive formats overall. And so, you know, you need to know when to push, when to take the risk with your Stein OTKs. You need to know when to take the push to try and stop a potential Stein OTK from your opponent. You need to actually think about a lot and manage a lot in these formats. But that being said, because Stein OTK is around, it will always be some aspect of luck, because you will be facing off against the Stein OTK deck a fair amount of the time. So I think the first format, Cyber, I actually think it's the most skillful of the Stein era formats. Reaper is maybe the next most skillful, because Reaper does have a fair amount of games that can just wind up in the grindy phase. But the reason why I put Cyber Goats above Reaper, because I think actually Reaper is in lots of variants, probably under Fiber, maybe above Chaos, but like it's somewhere here where Cyber is a bit above it. And because Cyber format, you know, there've been a fair amount of tournaments so far that has shown that Stein Monarch, while very good in the format, is hit by certain elements of the ban list, still being carried over from GOAT format, and also is hurt by the ruling on Last Will, which does work like it does in GOAT, and does not work how it does in a format like Reaper, where you can activate before or after the monster is sent to grave. So I do think that Cyber does indeed take some more luck right now. Of course, Reaper has been incredibly lapped out over the years, and that is why this format has sort of fallen from grace, because this was very popular a while ago, but people lapped it out, and Stein OTK just kept dominating, not even winning tournaments, just being a dominant force in the metagame. And so now it's like a bit more Stein intensive than something like Cyber Goat is right now. Of course, as time goes on, maybe Cyber will follow the same trajectory. Maybe it will fall a bit further on this tier list here. But I do think that Reaper format, unfortunately, is a bit under Cyber in terms of that. And that's why Cyber goes a bit above Reaper here. I think Reaper, for the games that are not Stein OTK, you get into very, very skill-intensive games, probably more skill-intensive than Chaos. But because Stein OTK is in the format, I don't think that I can place it above Fiber here. Next up, for the next Stein era format, we got Chaos Return. I think Chaos Return also sort of belongs in the lots of variants here, along with Reaper, because Stein is still very dominant there. But I think it, did it go above or below Reaper here? So Grateful Charity's in the format. I think that does place it below Reaper in terms of skill level. Still a very fun format, and of course, you know, non-Stein decks have won. I think Graceful Charity does boost up the Stein deck a little bit, and also introduce more variants, because Graceful Charity is a very variance-intensive card. You're seeing 3 more cards in your deck. You're setting your graveyard a bit. Yes, it does take skill to use, but I think overall, since you're seeing more of your deck, it will be more of a lots of variance type of thing. But next up, we get to the last Stein format, which is Stein itself, just Stein format. This format, I don't really enjoy it much compared to the other Stein format I've talked about on the channel. Ring of Destruction is back legal for this deck, so it's even more annoying and toxic. I'm going to place this thing in lots of variants under Chaos, actually. I think it does belong in this tier. I think that, you know, Reaper, Chaos Return, and Stein format are all sort of the more Stein-dominated formats of the Stein era. And as more testing goes on, maybe this will shift, right? For, you know, very self-evident reasons, not as much testing is going on in these formats anymore. Reaper has been lapped out a lot, so the sort of knowledge from Reaper format that's been gleaned can be applied to these other formats here. But, of course, with more testing, maybe strategies will be discovered that just stop Stein in its tracks. I mean, in Stein format itself, people thought Chainburn was going to be that strategy. I don't think it's quite there yet, even though Chainburn did top a Stein format event. But I do think that, like, you know, Stein is just sort of at the bottom of this tier. Not quite a coin toss, because there are decks that can compete with Stein, and those decks that can compete with Stein aren't necessarily tossing a coin because they have to do other things here. But I do think that Stein is kind of just in the lots of variance tier, on the brink of going down to the coin toss. Actually, I'm going to put it in coin toss, actually. Yeah, I'm going to put it here. I feel like it's reasonable to do this, because Stein decks, like, it's kind of like a non-game style of deck. And in a format where you can cause non-games like that, I do think it does belong in this tier. It's just much more dominant than it is even in Chaos Return format. And so, yeah, I'm putting it in the coin toss here. Moving on away from Stein format, we finally get to, in my opinion, the peak of the GX era that I've covered so far. Of course, I have not finished covering Perfect Circle format, so I'm reserving my judgment on Perfect Circle format in terms of, you know, how it compares to Chimera Tech. But Chimera Tech here, I think is very, very good. And I think Chimera Tech might be in the pure skill tier. It's just so underexplored right now that we can't really tell. So I'm going to put it at the bottom of pure skill. Could definitely fall into rewards good players in the future, but I think right now I'm going to put it in pure skill. Mainly because, like with Critter, this thing is very much not labbed out. And there is a machine OTK deck in the format. You know, you just Future Fusion plus Overload and you turn into Chimera Tech and win that way. But there are plenty of counters to that deck. I don't think the deck is that dominant. And I guess I'll put it in rewards good players at the top of reward good players because that deck does exist in the format. I guess I'll put it here. And it is like, I would say probably tier 1 or tier 2. But frankly, we just don't know what the meta of this format looks like yet. There's not been enough testing that's happened yet. We're going to be having more tournaments soon for this format. But it's still a wide open book. And I think that with more testing, this could definitely rise up in pure skill. It could fall below potentially as well, depending on which decks actually do turn out to be the best deck in the room. But I think right now, because it's such an undiscovered metagame, it does belong in the top of rewards good players. And also, there's nothing too degenerate that's going on in this format. Even the OTK is not really that degenerate compared to some of the other things we got on this list. And so I think that because you're entering a tournament with such an sort of finalized metagame, you have to really consider a lot of different things, and you have to really, really consider your deck choice. And that makes it sort of in the rewards good player tier right now. In addition to having to have good fundamentals, because you're not going to have anything too busted that'll just break open the game right away. So yeah, top of rewards good players for me. And I think this format's very fun. So I encourage people to try it out, and we'll have to see how it continues to stack up in this tier list in the future. Next, we got Airblade. Coin toss. I'm going to put in coin. I'm going to put it below Grateful Charity or Joey-Pegasus format in coin toss. Now, this could definitely change in the future because in the Airblade locals we held on the Yugioh from Zero Discord server, Airblade did not actually win that locals event. Now, locals are single format or single elimination tournaments that I hold on the Discord server every week. And, you know, they're generally pretty small as well. I think this had like 10 players, I think it was. I could be wrong about that. But it did not win. It actually lost, but it did make it to finals. But a fair amount of people did play Airblade. So, you know, it could definitely not be the best deck. However, I think because Airblade's so dominant in the format, kind of like how Science FDK is so dominant in the format for Scientist format, you know, you are going to run into this deck that is a combo deck. It's a Reason Gate combo deck that can brick, and maybe you win through that way, or it just pops off and you're dead. And the ways in which it pops off, I will say, like, it does take some skill to pilot. Again, all these decks take some skill to pilot, but I do think there is some element of luck to it. And especially like once you learn the main lines, you should be fine with it. And it's just so dominant of a deck. So I do want to put it in coin toss here. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put it down in coin toss. Next up, we've got Demise format, and Demise format is going to bring us back up into the rewards good players tier. Either rewards good players, some luck needed at the top of there, but I do think that it does reward good players. I'm going to put it, I'm going to put it bottom reward good players, or maybe above Android, because like the thing is with Android, it's a very skill intensive mirror for the tier 0 decks, but Demise format's a bit more unclear what the best deck in the room is. There's no Ryza in the format, so like Perfect Circle Monarch really isn't in contention for that title. Monarchs are still very good. Troop to Scoop stuff is still very good because Trooper is still legal in this format. But 6 Sams managed to win the last event. Demise OTK actually managed to a surprising amount of tops in that event. And you could argue that Demise OTK is a degenerate, you know, sort of luck-based deck, which I do think it is to some extent. But it's also very easy to decide against and play against. So I think the Demise OTK would probably fall in the rankings in the future. And just the other decks in the format are actually pretty skill intensive. Like, it's a very aggressive format, kind of like Vampire format's a very aggressive format. But I do think that Demise does belong here as opposed to below. You could definitely disagree with me on that. And the format is still untested enough to actually know whether it belongs here or in a lower tier. But I do want to put it in rewards good players for now. And I'm actually going to put Trooper format in the same sort of category because these formats are very similar. The difference that puts Trooper format over the top of Demise is that Perfect Circle Monarch is now a legitimate deck you can play. It doesn't have Light and Darkness Dragon, but you still have the Ryzas, and you can still make stuff happen with that. So I do think because Perfect Circle Monarch is a very skill-intensive deck that is in the format now, I think it does increase the skill level of the format, but I still think it's not quite on the level of Vampire. So I'm going to put it here. Yes, Trip Dupe Scoop is a problem and, you know, a bit aggressive and stuff like that, but I think that, honestly, most of the decks in this format take some amount of skill to pilot compared to a lot of the other decks here. And they're nothing like too luck-based. Yes, like, you can draw the God combo, but, like, generally there are ways to stop it and things that you can do to actually respond. So I'm going to put Trooper in rewards good players in this tier. So this tier is actually getting a bit more filled out than I expected it to be. And that's kind of interesting to see, because it's going to get filled out a little bit more. Oh, do I put Zombie in pure skill or rewards good players? Because Zombie and Perfect Circle are going to go basically in the same tier. I'll spoil that for you now. Because Zombie and Perfect Circle are basically the same format. There are some slight differences, but I do think that, you know, at the end of the day, Perfect Circle Monarch is still the dominant deck in the format, and the Perfect Circle Monarch is pretty good. I think Zombie takes a little bit less skill than Perfect Circle itself, because Perfect Circle format itself has like LAD in it, which, you know, add another wrinkle to that mirror. And also, you know, it's got Glider Beasts as a deck in the format that you can play if you want to. Glad Beasts, probably not on the same level as Perfect Circle Monarch, but it is a competent, like, tier 2 deck at the very least, maybe even tier 1. Yeah, I guess I'll put Zombie at the top of reward goods players, and then Perfect Circle at the bottom of pure skill. Yeah, I'll line it up like this. Maybe it should be reversed, actually. I'm not going to reverse it here. I haven't played enough with LAD to really see how it impacts the game, like, on a super, like, nuanced level. But I can definitely see LAD being something where it's like, well, LAD decreases the skill in the game, because if it hits the field, then, you know, your opponent's kind of cooked, right? But the way I view it is that LAD is a 2-tribute monster that can be hard to bring out. So you've got to deck build around that in a way that enables it. And also you've got to sort of play it in a way that, you know, it doesn't get immediately outed by your opponent, because, like, you don't want to summon LAD into like a Treeborn Frog in their graveyard, right? And there are plenty of different examples of that sort of thing where you want to save LAD for the right moment. So I think LAD is ultimately a more skill intensive card than not, which does put Perfect Circle into the pure skill category for me. But I'll put Zombie in there as well. Honestly, Zombie and Perfect Circle should be combined into one. Main reason I covered them as separate things was because I was just going through the ones on Format Library. But Format Library actually has recently sort of eliminated Zombie from their coverage. So, you know, if I was covering it now, I'd just sort of ditch Zombie and just cover Perfect Circle. But because they're basically the same thing, I'm going to put them in the same tier. And I do think they do involve a lot of skill. Putting them below Yugi-Kaiba for now, that might just be unfamiliarity on my part. But the way I view it is it's kind of like how Android's at the bottom of the rewards good players tier, because you do have to just learn sort of the mirror. And, you know, the mirror can be complicated, but you're not learning as many different decks as you would in something like Yugi-Kaiba format, which, to be fair, not many decks, but it is 2, which is bigger than 1. So I will put Yugi-Kaiba above Perfect Circle in terms of pure skill for now. But the fact that they're in the pure skill tier at all is a very, very good thing for Perfect Circle and Zombie. Like, very fun. And whichever one you play, you should have a fun time, because, you know, if you enjoy that Perfect Circle gameplay, you should have a blast. And I sort of mentioned multiple times throughout this video that, like, the ranking of these formats could definitely change over time, depending on how they develop. You know, Reaper format, back when it was first being explored, would probably be like up here or something, but now it's down here. So these things change over time, you know, and with further discoveries and further innovations, this could rapidly switch up in the future. But I think for now, at the start of 2025, this is what the sort of Yu-Gi-Oh! Skill tier list looks like for the formats that I've covered. I had a lot of fun making this video, and again, don't take any of this too personally. I'd love to know what you think are the most skill-intensive formats in the game, and what you think are the least skill-intensive formats in the game. So let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to suggest videos that I make in the future, then definitely join my Patreon, linked in the description down below. If you join at the $3 or higher tier, then you will be able to suggest these for yourself. So head over there if you want to support me directly, and also head over to the Yugioh from Zero Discord server if you want to play games in these formats and play in our tournaments that we hold. We hold locals every week and monthly tournaments every month. I hope that you enjoyed. As always, like, comment, and subscribe as always. And as always, big shout out to my patrons: Rinsewin, Pork Raccoon, Brent Knocker, Tyler Compton, GeoMyFS, Dumptruck, Scout Zero, and Damon Hess. It means a lot that you all support me this way and truly make more videos like this one in the future. But that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed as always. And until next time, I've been Ben from Yugioh from Zero. I'm signing off.